One of the definitions of a primary color is a color that can't be mixed using any other color, and today I'm going to be using secondaries only and showing why that is actually false. I've taken a moment to list the exact pigments that I'm using if you want to replicate this study in your own practice, but I've often thought that limited color palettes are an excellent way to understand color theory and how contextual colors are. You can see here by mixing the two secondaries that straddle the primary, I'm mixing what is an approximate primary, and obviously these are much more muted than the secondaries, the pigment straight from the tube, but we're going to jump into the color wheel and I'm going to show you how contextual all of the different colors are relative to each other. I highly recommend anytime you do a limited color palette to do a color wheel just to see what your range of color you have is. Like something like a Zorn palette doesn't have a lot of great blues and purples, and this palette has a lot of great cool tones. The warmer tones are a little bit more difficult. You can see the yellow I've mixed here is like kind of a sap green, but compared to all the other colors, it's the yellow-est color. And I think that concept is really the magic of this palette. I've also provided the reference photo if you want to screenshot that and do this on your own time. And you can see whenever I label this is approximately sort of the color spectrum I'm working with, which is why it's important to next analyze the value. Basically, how light and how dark does this limited palette go? And for this particular palette, I suspect that it's going to be very high key, which just means it's going to be lighter, the lighter half of the value scale. And so right now I'm mixing a gray. Luckily, my palette is gray. I have a YouTube video on how I made that if you're interested. But I'm using a little bit of all of these secondaries to mix what I feel is a pretty neutral gray. And by mixing all the colors without adding any white, I'm able to find my darkest value. And I'm putting a little bit of a value scale here. I'm using my value checker that I actually built for a segment of Not Sorry Art School to check my value. I'm also using these red tinted glasses to cancel out all the color. And you can see here, my darkest gray is really only one shade darker than my middle gray. So this is gonna be a pretty high key color palette. The next step is the block in. This is not unique to these color studies, but I'm just gonna do my wash to give myself a nice tone. That way I'm not combating with a white background. This is something I do all the time. A lot of painters do this. It's a great way to sort of have a better understanding of value. And then of course I'm doing the draw in, and I do believe I'm using that dark gray that I mixed as my draw line because it's a great contrast. And I also want to be really careful with the chroma, or the color that I'm introducing, because as I'll mention in a minute, I'm doing some very delicate footwork here in getting my secondaries to create what feels like a very full color palette. I'm going to leave my color wheel up just to give a little more context when it comes to understanding the relative colors that I'll be using within this painting. Okay, color or color strategy. Basically, I'm trying to determine how I'm going to handle my yellow. So when I look at my color palette, the thing that appears to be the biggest challenge is getting my kind of khaki olive green yellow to read as yellow within the context of this painting. A great way to make a yellow feel more yellowy is to have a lot of the other colors in the rest of the painting lean a little bit more cool and even almost a little bit more violet in order to create a sense of simultaneous contrast, which basically just means like the color that you're using is always going to be affected by the colors that are directly surrounding this. And this of course could be the entire painting, but it could also be, in this case, the white that I'm going to put next to the yellow. Another thing that I'm taking into mind when it comes to my color strategy is I'm wanting my sunglasses here, which are orange. Orange and yellow are neighbors on the color wheel, to pull more red than I think I would have normally. So typically orange, whenever it's in sunlight, if I had access to the entire full color spectrum, I would have it pull pretty yellow. But I'm making a distinct choice in order to have it pull more of a reddish orange. That way there is some space between the yellowy orange juice cup behind it, the thing that I know would be the most challenging if I didn't really have a plan. And I will say the insight to have a plan comes from years and years and years of doing color studies. If you are doing this for the first time ever, what might end up happening, I can almost guarantee it, is it won't come out like you had hoped. And it's in the multiple attempts after that a lot of the learning happens. And I know that that's not you know, a fun answer and it doesn't yield a great painting right away, and it's very counter to what our culture really enjoys, which is that instant gratification. But I can tell you that if you're willing to do studies like this and do things that are really challenging, that's what sort of separates what I consider to be the really thoughtful, skilled painters from maybe more of like a hobby painter, which both are totally fine and valid, but it's in this kind of work that you're going to get the most experience. So another thing to be mindful of during the color application is keeping value in mind. So in my reference photo, the blueberries are very dark. They're probably maybe the darkest thing in my composition, and they're almost the darkest value. So if I had access to the full color palette, I might mix something that's next door neighbors to black, but because we only can go a little past halfway down our value scale, I'm gonna have to make an effort to make everything a little bit more light and compressed in value in order to have that punchiness. An example of me navigating this is the blueberry and its shadow. Initially, I made the shadow pretty true to the value in my reference photo, but I realized that it would look, you wouldn't be able to see the definition of the blueberry casting the shadow if I didn't lighten it. So I went back and mixed some white in with the blue I mixed for the shadow, and this seemed to correct it. But it's things like that that you'll have to take into account whenever you are dealing with a limited color palette, especially one like this one that yields you a very limited value range. And something that might be more subtle here that I'm intentionally doing is normally when I do sort of a background white, like my reference photo is kind of calling for, it's usually mixed a very creamy color. I typically use like a yellow ochre, maybe a hint of dioxazine violet to create sort of that creamy off-white color. It's almost never stark white, especially if I want my highlights to pop. I try not to use just straight titanium white, but in this case I made a concerted effort to do sort of a rusty reddish violet color mixed in with my white. But the reason I did this is, again, I understand that my weakest link here is my yellow orange juice, and by having a white that reads as white, however in true, you know, local color, it's actually more of a very pale, muted purple. I'm giving my yellow just a little bit more of a chance to read as yellow, as opposed to sort of what it actually is, which is a sort of khaki color, truly almost a green. And someone who has a good handle of color theory will often make these color strategy moves and decisions in a way that really isn't perceptible. And that's because so much of what happens when we look at color is just under our awareness and our perception, which is why I think studying color theory is like, it almost makes you like a magician. It really is almost magical. If you're enjoying this video, make sure to subscribe, hit the bell notification so that you can be the first to get new videos. I will also say that I have a book out, Modern Still Life from Fruit Bowls to Disco Balls, if you would like to have this education in book form. And finally, if you really want to take your painting skills to the next level and master color theory and painting representationally, I have an entire online course dedicated to servicing artists in their quest to paint more representationally. So I provided all the links below if you want to check those out. So a lot of the refinement here is just pumping up the values and really punching up the chroma where I can. Specifically, I do have an orange that's very saturated straight from the tube, my Cadmium Orange. And so I'm adding that plus white to give these punchy highlights and to really let the viewer know what the texture of these glasses are. A lot of times highlight and paint application lets the viewer know the texture. So it's always the thing I save kind of for last, because I want my value, my color to do most of the heavy lifting. And then the little bits of highlight, the last finishing touches, gives the viewer sort of an experience on what everything in this composition might feel like to touch, which as a painter, someone who loves to paint representationally, is always really fun. Additionally, I like to save any sort of details, like for example, on this orange juice glass, there is an image of orange with leaves on it, and I'm saving that for this point. And I will say, although this looks like an orange, I actually am mixing a color that's much closer to the red that I've mixed in my color wheel in order, again, to create that great sense of contrast. Your brain is going to read this as orange, despite the fact that it really is kind of halfway between my red and my red orange on my color wheel. But by contrast of my, again, not a very good yellow, but a great contextual yellow, it'll still have the space in order for the viewer to read it as more yellow than it actually is. And by giving my very muted primaries a lot of space, basically not using a lot of their neighbors, I'm able to sort of create the effect of a primary without having access to one. So here's my palette. I always like to show that afterwards. And of course the finished product. I'm also going to include a slide of the reference photo next to it. And I think the biggest difference is honestly more the value and the fact that I didn't have a very dark color to work with, more than the color. And this is made entirely out of secondaries. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this, make sure to subscribe and check out all the links I've listed below. And happy creating. I'll talk to you guys next week.